My mother-in-law hospitalized my child last summer, but my husband's still on her side. My husband's mother has always been one of those people who thinks she knows best about everything. I raised 3 strong boys when the economy was toughest in the 80s. They didn't need babysitters, she'd say. At first, I admired her. I wanted to be just as resilient of a parent as her. But when I gave birth to my son, she constantly criticized the way I parented. From how I held him to the toys I gave to him, nothing seemed to be okay with her. I tried talking to my husband about it, but he just shrugged, saying, "Take it easy. She's always been like that. She just wants the best for us." So for years, I let her little comments just go in one ear and out the other. But recently, she'd gotten a whole lot worse. She started ignoring all the rules I gave when it came to babysitting. I'd say no sugar after 6, and she'd load him up with candy. I'd say bedtime is 8, and she'd keep him up till 10. The worst part was she'd tell my son, "You don't have to listen to mommy's silly rules when grandma is around." And it got so bad that my son started talking back to me saying, "But grandma lets me." Even at family gatherings, my mother-in-law would make fun of me in front of everyone for using a car seat booster for my son. Back then, we didn't need all those expensive baby products. I just threw my kids in the trunk and they turned out fine. When I tried to explain current safety standards, she rolled her eyes and said I was brainwashed by social media. My husband just sat there agreeing to everything that came out of her mouth, and it frustrated me. "I'm not going to another family gathering if your mom is always going to act like this," I told him later in the car. He sighed and said, "I told you. You can't be so sensitive around her." And honestly, everything she said was true. Maybe you should try trusting her judgment. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stayed silent the rest of the ride home while my husband continued to call me childish for the way I was reacting. But the thing that really set me off most was when she started mocking my son's severe peanut allergy. She'd say things like, "Back then, kids didn't have all these health and mental problems like they do today. It's ridiculous. Parents just make these things up for attention." It was so crazy I thought she was kidding, but I was wrong. 2 Sundays ago, during a family dinner, my mother-in-law started going on and on about how my parenting was too soft and how I was raising my son to be weak. Then she pulled out a little candy bar with peanuts and almost handed it over to my son before I slapped it out of her hand. I stood up and glared at her. "That's it. You're never going to see your grandson until you figure out how to actually be nice and respect my family's boundaries," I said sternly, taking my son to his room to make sure he's fine. My husband went up after a couple of minutes with an angry expression. "You shouldn't have done that to her. Now she's downstairs crying when all she wanted to do was help." "Help? You're kidding, right? She tried harming our child. Your son," I shouted back. He shook his head at me and walked back out to continue having dinner with his family. After that, I stopped inviting his family over, declined every time she offered to babysit. My husband was still angry at me, saying I was being unfair and holding a grudge over nothing. But I didn't care. My son's health was my priority. But last week, I had to leave town when my mom suddenly collapsed. My husband promised he'd stay home with our son. So before I left, I showed him exactly where to find the EpiPen and reminded him about all our rules. "Absolutely no peanuts, okay?" "I got it. Go and focus on your mom," he said just before I had to rush out. But apparently, after an hour of watching our kid, my husband needed to urgently step out to visit some friends and watch an important game. He dropped off our child to his mom, handed over the EpiPen, and told her all the rules that she called useless just weeks ago, expecting her to follow it. She rolled her eyes and said, "Fine, fine," and he thought that was the end of it. But he was wrong. After he left, she decided to prove once and for all that I'd been lying about the allergy. She gave my son peanut butter cookies, thinking she could finally show everyone I was being overdramatic. But then she watched his face swell up, then panicked as he started turning purple and blue right in front of her. She called my husband crying for help while she struggled with the EpiPen. He quickly called 911 and raced back to see the damage. My husband called me an hour later at the hospital. Our son, he had an attack. I drove like a maniac to get there, just in time to hear his mother confess that she'd given him peanut butter to see if the allergy was real. But she wasn't even sorry. If you hadn't coddled him so much, maybe his immune system would be stronger. Even the staff couldn't believe it. That's when I decided that my mother-in-law needed to be unalived. I pushed through the hospital room door and there she was, standing next to my son's bed like she had any right to be there. Her face was red and puffy from crying, but I didn't care. She opened her mouth to say something, but I cut her off before she could start. I pointed at the door and told my husband to get his mother out of this room right now or I was calling security. My voice shook so badly I barely recognized it. She tried to touch my arm and I jerked away like she'd burned me. My husband stepped between us and asked me to calm down. Calm down. I stared at him like he'd grown a second head. His mother started crying again, saying she didn't mean for this to happen and she was so sorry. But her sorry meant nothing because my son was lying in that bed with tubes in his arm because of what she did on purpose. My husband actually had the nerve to defend her. He said she made a mistake and didn't mean for things to go this far. That word, mistake, made something snap inside me. I screamed that she deliberately poisoned our child to prove a point. The words came out so loud that a nurse rushed in from the hallway. She put her hand on my shoulder and asked everyone to please lower their voices because there were other patients trying to rest. I was shaking all over and couldn't seem to stop. My mother-in-law kept saying over and over that she just wanted to show everyone I was being too worried about nothing. The nurse looked between all of us and said maybe some people should wait in the family room down the hall. My husband tried to argue, but the nurse was firm. She said my son needed calm and quiet right now. Not all this yelling and upset. The ER doctor came in a few minutes later and asked to speak with me privately. We stepped just outside the room where I could still see my son through the window. She explained that he was stable now, but they needed to keep him overnight to watch for delayed reactions. Sometimes the body has a second response hours after the first one. She asked me very specific questions about how he got exposed to peanuts. Did he eat something at home? Did someone give him food without checking? I told her exactly what happened. How my mother-in-law fed him peanut butter cookies on purpose because she didn't believe the allergy was real. The doctor's face changed as I talked. She wrote everything down in her notes and said she needed to document this very carefully. I could tell from the way she looked at me that she knew something was really wrong with this whole situation. I went back into the room and refused to leave my son's bedside. My husband took his mother to the waiting room finally. My boy looked so tiny in that big hospital bed with the IV needle taped to his little arm. The monitors beeped steadily next to him, tracking his heart rate and oxygen. I kept thinking about that moment weeks ago, when I slapped the candy bar out of her hand at the family dinner. I should have done more then. I should have cut her off completely right then, instead of just avoiding her. Maybe if I'd been stronger about it, we wouldn't be here now. He was sleeping, but his face still looked puffy and red. I pulled the chair right up next to his bed and held his other hand, the one without the IV. I wasn't going to let anyone else near him. Around midnight, a woman knocked softly and came in. She introduced herself as the hospital social worker and said she needed to talk to me about what happened tonight. I was so tired, but I told her everything. I started with how my mother-in-law had always ignored my rules and boundaries. How she mocked me for using car seats and following safety guidelines. How she told my son he didn't have to listen to my rules when she was around. I explained about the peanut allergy and how she'd made fun of it for years, saying kids today didn't have real problems. I told her about the candy bar incident at dinner and how I'd banned her from seeing my son after that. Then I explained how my husband dropped our son off with her anyway when I had to leave town for my mom's emergency. The social worker wrote everything down and asked questions about dates and specific things my mother-in-law had said. She wanted to know if my husband knew about the boundary I'd set. I said yes, he absolutely knew, and I'd reminded him about the peanut rules right before I left. She closed her notebook and looked at me very seriously. She said that deliberately feeding a known allergen to a child counts as medical neglect and possibly abuse. It wasn't an accident if someone did it on purpose to test whether the allergy was real. The hospital was required by law to file a report with Child Protective Services because this was an intentional exposure, not an accident. My stomach dropped, but also I felt this weird sense of relief. Finally, someone official was saying out loud that what happened was wrong and dangerous. She said CPS would contact me within a few days to do an investigation. They'd want to talk to me, my husband, and probably my mother-in-law. She promised this was about making sure my son stayed safe going forward, not about punishing anyone. My husband came back in right after she left. I told him about the CPS report and he completely lost it. He said I was destroying his family over an honest mistake. There was that word again. Mistake. I asked him how it was a mistake when his mother admitted she gave the cookies on purpose. He said she didn't understand how serious it really was. I pointed out that I'd been telling everyone how serious it was for years, but nobody listened. He got defensive and said I was always so extreme about everything. The social worker's words were still fresh in my mind, and I felt stronger knowing someone official agreed with me. I told him that CPS filing a report wasn't my choice. It was the law, and maybe he should think about why the hospital felt it was necessary. We ended up in the hallway at 2 a.m. having a huge fight about what counts as an honest mistake. Other people in the waiting area stared at us, but I didn't care anymore. I said his mother admitted she gave our son peanut butter to prove the allergy wasn't real. That was the exact opposite of accidental. He argued that she didn't mean for him to actually get sick. She just didn't believe it would happen. I asked him what he thought would happen when someone with a severe peanut allergy eats peanut butter. Did he think fairy dust would protect him? He said I was being cruel and his mom was devastated by what happened. I said our son almost died and that's what should devastate everyone, not hurt feelings. He finally broke down crying. He admitted he never should have left our son with his mother after I'd set that boundary. He said he knew I was serious, but he thought just a few hours wouldn't matter. Then he tried to say we were both to blame. Me for being too strict with the rules and his mom for going too far. I stared at him while he cried and tried to split the blame 50-50. Like my crime of having rules about a life-threatening allergy was somehow equal to his mother deliberately feeding poison to our child. I couldn't believe he was still trying to make this about me being unreasonable. I told him there was no both sides when someone deliberately put a child's life in danger. I was done pretending his mother's feelings mattered more than our son's safety. He looked shocked, like he'd never heard me talk this firmly before. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe I'd been too soft for too long, trying to keep the peace and not rock the boat. But that was over now. I said I didn't care if his whole family hated me forever. I didn't care if he thought I was being unfair or holding grudges. Our son almost died tonight because people didn't take his allergy seriously. That was never going to happen again, no matter who I had to cut out of our lives to keep him safe. My husband just stood there in the hallway with tears running down his face, and I walked back to our son's room and shut the door. The next morning, I woke up in the chair next to my son's hospital bed, with my neck killing me and my back all stiff. He stirred around 6 and his eyes opened slowly, looking confused about where he was. Then his little hand went to his throat and he touched it carefully like it hurt. He looked at me with tears starting to form and asked why his throat felt so bad and scratchy. I sat on the edge of his bed and brushed his hair back while he kept touching his neck. Then he asked why Grandma gave him cookies that made him so sick and had to come to the hospital. Hearing him try to figure out why someone who said she loved him would hurt him on purpose broke something deep inside my chest. I took a breath and tried to keep my voice steady. I told him that Grandma made a very bad choice and gave him something she knew would make him sick. I said he was never going to be alone with her again, and that Mommy would make sure he stayed safe. My husband walked in right then holding 2 cups of coffee and heard what I said. He started to open his mouth to argue, but I turned and looked at him with an expression that made him shut it immediately. He set the coffee down and walked back out without saying anything. Around noon, a different doctor came in to check my son's vitals and look at his throat. She said the swelling had gone down enough that we could go home, but we needed to follow up with our allergist within the week. She handed me a thick stack of paperwork and discharge instructions. Then she leaned in close and said quietly that she had documented everything exactly as I described it in the report. She touched my arm and said to keep those papers somewhere safe. I thanked her and felt like crying from relief that someone believed me and was taking this seriously. We got my son dressed in the spare clothes my husband had brought, and I carried him out to the car even though he could walk. My phone rang while we were driving, and I saw it was my mom calling from her hospital 2 hours away. I answered, and she immediately started apologizing for the timing of her collapse and asking if my son was okay. I told her he was fine and that none of this was her fault. She asked what I was going to do, and I said I was handling the situation, even though I honestly had no idea if I actually was. She said she'd be released in a couple days and would come stay with me if I needed help. I told her I'd let her know, and we hung up. Back home, I walked straight to my son's room and started pulling clothes out of his dresser. My husband followed me asking what I was doing. I said I was moving all of our son's things into my bedroom, and he could sleep in the guest room. He said I was being dramatic again, and that we needed to talk about this like adults. I kept packing clothes into a garbage bag and told him I was past caring what he thought was dramatic versus necessary. He stood there watching me carry armloads of toys and books down the hall. I made up the small daybed in my room for my son, and brought in his nightlight and favorite blankets. My husband tried to argue more, but I just closed the door in his face. That evening, after my son fell asleep early, I sat on the couch with my laptop. My hands were shaking as I typed "grandmother endangering grandchild" into the search bar. I forced myself to keep reading even though every article made me feel sick. I found a family law firm that handled protective orders and custody issues, and left a voicemail at midnight explaining everything that happened. My voice cracked halfway through, but I kept talking until the beep cut me off. The next morning, I was making breakfast when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A woman said this was Tina's office calling back about my voicemail. She said Tina had listened to my message first thing and wanted to squeeze me in for a consultation that same afternoon if I could make it. I said yes immediately, and she told me to bring all documentation of the incident. I spent the rest of the morning gathering hospital papers, old text messages from my mother-in-law, and photos of my son's medical alert bracelet. At 2 o'clock, I walked into Tina's office in a building downtown. She was younger than I expected, with dark hair pulled back and a firm handshake. We sat in her conference room, and I laid out the whole history starting from when my son was born. I told her about years of boundary stomping and the constant criticism of my parenting. I described the public humiliation at family gatherings and her mocking comments about the allergy. Then I explained the deliberate allergy testing that put my son in the hospital. Tina listened without interrupting and took detailed notes about everything. She asked specific questions about dates and who witnessed different incidents. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. She said I had strong grounds for a protective order against my mother-in-law based on the intentional harm. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She asked gently if I thought my husband could be trusted with unsupervised custody, given his pattern of enabling his mother. That question hit me hard because I had been so focused on his mother that I hadn't fully processed my husband's role in all this. He knew about the boundary I had set. He knew about the severity of the allergy. And he still handed our son over to her anyway. Tina closed her notepad and leaned forward across the conference table. She told me I needed to start documenting everything from this point on. Every text message from my mother-in-law. Every time my husband pressured me to reconcile. Every attempt at contact. She said she'd seen cases like mine before where family members slowly wore down the protective parent until they gave in. I nodded and pulled out my phone to start a notes file right there in her office. She watched me create the document and then added that I should go back through my memory and write down every incident I could remember with dates if possible. The more detailed the timeline, the stronger my case would be if we ended up in court. I thanked her and left her office feeling both scared and relieved that someone finally understood how serious this was. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and started typing. I created a document titled Incident Timeline and began with the day my son was born. I remembered how my mother-in-law criticized the way I held him in the hospital, then the comments about breastfeeding being unnecessary. The first time she ignored my rule about visitors washing their hands. I kept typing and the document grew longer. The candy after bedtime. The mocking at family dinners. Her telling my son he didn't have to listen to my rules. The car seat comments. Every single peanut allergy joke. Writing it all down made my hands shake because I realized I'd been making excuses for terrible behavior for years. I'd told myself she meant well. That she was just old-fashioned. That I was being too sensitive like my husband always said. But seeing it all listed out in black and white showed me a clear pattern of someone who had never respected me as a parent and had actively undermined my authority with my own child. I was still typing when I heard my husband's car pull into the driveway around 6. He walked in and dropped his keys on the counter. He didn't even ask how my day was or check on our son who was playing in his room. Instead, he immediately started talking about when his mother could see our son again. Not if. When. Like it was already decided that I would eventually give in. I closed my laptop and looked at him. I told him the answer was never. She was never going to be alone with our son again. He needed to accept that, or we had much bigger problems than his mother. His face got red and he raised his voice asking how long I planned to hold this grudge. I stood up from the table and walked over to my bag where I'd put the consultation notes from Tina. I pulled out the folder and opened it on the counter in front of him. He looked down at the papers and I watched his face change as he read. His eyes stopped on the words protective order, and he went pale. He looked up at me and asked if I was seriously considering a restraining order against his mother. I told him I wasn't considering it. I was doing it. He slammed his hand on the counter and said I was being vindictive, that I was holding a grudge and trying to punish his mother instead of protecting our son. I felt something snap inside me. I asked him how keeping a woman who deliberately poisoned our child away from him was vindictive. He didn't have an answer for that. He just kept saying I was taking this too far and being unfair. That's when we had the worst fight of our entire marriage. He finally admitted something I'd suspected for years but never wanted to believe. He said he'd always thought I was making too big a deal about the allergy. That he believed his mother when she said modern parents invented problems for attention. He'd been humoring me all these years. Humoring me. Like our son's life-threatening medical condition was some kind of phase I was going through. I stared at him and felt like I was looking at a complete stranger. This man I'd been married to for 8 years had never actually believed our son could die from eating peanuts. He thought I was being dramatic, overprotective, making things up. Suddenly everything made sense. The dismissive comments when I asked him to check ingredient labels, the reluctance to enforce rules with his family, the constant pressure to give his mother more access to our son. He'd never taken any of it seriously because he didn't think the danger was real. I told him he needed to leave the house for a few days while I figured out what to do next. He refused at first and said it was his house too and I couldn't just kick him out. I looked him right in the eyes and reminded him that I was the one who slapped a candy bar out of his mother's hand to save our son's life while he sat there and did nothing. I was the one who set the boundary that could have prevented all of this. And he was the one who handed our son over to his mother so he could watch a game with his friends. He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. He just stood there for a minute and then walked down the hall to our bedroom. I heard him pulling clothes out of drawers and opening closet doors. He came back 20 minutes later with a duffel bag packed. He stopped in the doorway and told me I was tearing our family apart. I was destroying everything because I couldn't let go of one mistake. I felt my jaw tighten. I told him his mother tore our family apart the second she fed peanut butter cookies to a child she knew was allergic. He shook his head and walked out. I heard his car start and watched through the window as he backed out of the driveway. My son came out of his room asking where Daddy was going. I told him Daddy needed to stay with Uncle Mike for a little while and gave him a hug. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice said this was Dominic from Child Protective Services calling about a report filed at the hospital. My stomach dropped. I knew the hospital had to report what happened, but actually getting the call made it real. Dominic asked if I could schedule a home visit so he could talk to me and see where my son lived. I said yes right away, even though part of me was terrified of being investigated. But another part of me was grateful that someone official was finally taking this seriously and documenting everything that happened. We set up an appointment for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. Tuesday came and I spent the whole morning cleaning even though the house was already clean. I was nervous about what Dominic would think or what questions he'd ask. The doorbell rang exactly at 10, and I opened it to find a man in his 40s with a clipboard and a kind face. He introduced himself as Dominic and asked if he could come in. I led him to the living room and offered him coffee, which he declined. He sat down and pulled out some papers. He explained that he'd already reviewed the hospital social worker's report and talked to the ER doctor who treated my son. Now he needed to hear my side of the story and see my son's medical records. I pulled out the folder I'd prepared with all of my son's allergy documentation. Test results from when he was 2. The action plan from our allergist. Photos of his medical alert bracelet. The discharge papers from the hospital. Dominic looked through everything carefully and took notes. He asked me to walk him through the whole history with my mother-in-law. I told him about years of boundary violations, the constant criticism. her mocking the allergy, the incident where I had to slap food out of her hand, my explicit instruction to my husband not to leave our son with her. Everything. Dominic listened without interrupting, and his expression got more serious as I talked. When I finished, he set down his pen and told me he was clearly concerned about the intentional nature of the exposure. This wasn't an accident or a mistake. My mother-in-law had deliberately given my son something she knew he was allergic to in order to prove a point. He set down his clipboard and looked at me seriously. He told me that CPS wasn't trying to punish anyone or tear families apart. Their only concern was making sure my son stayed safe going forward. Then he asked me detailed questions about my husband's judgment. Could I trust him to protect our son from his mother? Would he put our child in danger again if his mom pressured him? Did I believe he understood how serious the allergy actually was? I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out at first. My hands started shaking, and I had to set down my coffee cup before I spilled it. I told him honestly that I didn't know anymore. That uncertainty was killing me because I never thought I'd have to protect my child from his own father's poor decisions. I'd always trusted my husband completely until he dropped our son off at the one place I'd explicitly said was unsafe. Dominic nodded slowly like he'd heard this exact story 100 times before. He wrote something down in his notes and told me that was a very honest answer. He said a lot of parents in my situation tried to defend their spouse even when the evidence showed serious problems. He recommended I follow through with the protective order Tina mentioned. He also suggested family therapy if my husband wanted to rebuild trust and prove he could prioritize our son's safety over his mother's feelings. CPS would keep the case open for 90 days to monitor the situation and make sure all safety plans were being followed. He'd check in every 2 weeks and wanted to see documentation of any attempts by my mother-in-law to contact us. I thanked him and walked him to the door. After he left, I just stood in the hallway for a minute trying to process everything. My husband came home from his brother's place that evening. I was making dinner when he walked in and immediately started yelling about CPS showing up at his work to interview him. He accused me of reporting him to the authorities and trying to get our son taken away. His face was red and he kept pacing back and forth in the kitchen. I had to explain multiple times that the hospital filed the report, not me. Medical professionals are required by law to report child endangerment. He didn't want to hear it. He said I must have told the hospital staff to make it sound worse than it was. I reminded him that our son almost died and his mother admitted she did it on purpose. He went quiet for a minute, then stormed off to the guest room and slammed the door. The next morning, his mother started calling my phone. When I didn't answer, she started texting. At first, the messages were tearful apologies about how sorry she was and how she'd never forgive herself. By afternoon, the tone changed completely. She sent angry texts saying I was keeping her grandson from her and destroying her relationship with her son. She called me controlling and said I'd always manipulated her boy. The messages kept coming all day and into the evening. Finally, she left a voicemail that made my blood boil. Her voice was shaking with anger as she said I'd always been a controlling witch who manipulated her son, and now I was using this accident to turn him against his own mother. I blocked her number immediately and saved all the messages to show Tina. I called Tina the next day and told her I wanted to move forward with the protective order. She scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. In her office, I showed her all the text messages and the voicemail. She made copies of everything and started drafting the petition. She explained we were filing for a temporary protective order that would go into effect immediately if approved. The order would request that my mother-in-law have no contact with my son whatsoever. She also had to stay at least 500 feet away from our home and his school. We'd get a court date within 2 weeks for a hearing where a judge would decide whether to make it permanent. Tina filed the paperwork that same day. Within 48 hours, my husband's entire family started a campaign to pressure me into dropping the order. His oldest brother called saying I was overreacting and his mother had learned her lesson. His younger brother sent text messages about how I was tearing the family apart over one mistake. His aunt showed up at my door uninvited one afternoon trying to convince me to reconsider. She stood on my porch for 20 minutes talking about forgiveness and family loyalty. I closed the door on her mid-sentence. Someone in the family posted vague accusations about me on social media. The post didn't use my name, but anyone who knew the situation would know exactly who it was about. It said some people use their children as weapons to hurt family members who love them. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from relatives I barely knew. I screenshot every text message, saved every voicemail, and documented every time someone showed up at my house. I forwarded everything to Tina in one big email. She called me an hour later and said this pattern of harassment actually strengthened our case. It showed the family's complete lack of respect for boundaries, and their belief that they were entitled to access, despite serious safety concerns. She warned me that family court could get really ugly when one side felt entitled to a relationship no matter what. She told me to keep documenting everything and not to engage with any of them. The day before court, my husband came to me looking defeated. He sat down at the kitchen table and begged me to reconsider. He said his mother was devastated and had definitely learned her lesson. She understood now how serious the allergy was. I looked at him and asked what lesson exactly she'd learned. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I asked him if she'd ever actually admitted she was wrong or apologized for nearly killing our son. He couldn't answer because she hadn't. She'd never once taken responsibility or shown real remorse. She'd only cried about how this was affecting her and how unfair I was being. He put his head in his hands and didn't say anything else. The next morning, I put on my best clothes and drove to the courthouse with all my documentation in a folder. Tina met me outside and we went through security together. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. My mother-in-law sat on the other side with a lawyer I didn't recognize. She was wearing a nice dress and had tissues in her hand. My husband sat in the back looking miserable. The judge came in and we all stood up. He reviewed the petition and asked to hear from both sides. I went first. I handed over the medical records from the hospital, the discharge papers, the allergist's documentation of the severe allergy. I explained the history of boundary violations and her stated belief that the allergy wasn't real. The judge looked through everything carefully. Then my mother-in-law's lawyer stood up. She cried and said she just forgot about the allergy in the moment. She claimed it was an honest mistake and she'd never intentionally hurt her grandson. The judge looked at her directly and asked if she gave my son peanut butter on purpose. She hesitated for a long moment. Her lawyer whispered something to her. Finally, she admitted yes. She had given it to him intentionally because she wanted to see if the allergy was actually real or if I was making it up. The judge's face changed completely when he heard her say that. His expression went from professional to something much harder, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He flipped through the medical records again, then looked at my mother-in-law for a long moment before speaking. He granted the temporary protective order right there, no hesitation. She couldn't contact my son at all, couldn't come within 500 feet of our house or his school. The judge set another hearing in 3 months to decide if the order should be permanent. My mother-in-law's lawyer tried to object, but the judge cut her off. He said any grandmother who admits to deliberately exposing a child to a known allergen to prove a point has shown she can't be trusted with that child's safety. That's when my mother-in-law completely lost it. She stood up and started screaming that I'd turned her son against her. Her voice got louder and louder, yelling that I'd stolen her grandchild and she had rights. The judge banged his gavel and told her to sit down, but she kept going. She pointed at me across the courtroom and called me a liar and a manipulator. Security came through the side door, 2 officers in uniform. They moved toward her table and her lawyer grabbed her arm, trying to get her to stop talking. But she shook the lawyer off and kept screaming about how she raised 3 boys just fine, and I was ruining her family. The officers took her by both arms and started walking her toward the exit. She tried to pull away from them, still yelling that she had rights and I couldn't do this to her. Her voice echoed through the whole courtroom as they led her out. I could hear her in the hallway even after the doors closed. Something about grandparents' rights and how I'd pay for this. The judge looked tired suddenly, like he'd seen this kind of thing too many times before. He told everyone remaining that the order was effective immediately, and court was done. I glanced back at my husband sitting in the last row. His face looked completely broken, watching his mother get dragged out by security. For just a second, I felt bad for him. This was his mom, even if she'd done something terrible. But then I remembered my son's face swelling up, turning purple and blue. I remembered the panic in my husband's voice when he called from the hospital. My son almost died because she wanted to prove me wrong. I couldn't let feeling guilty about my husband's pain make me forget that. My job was keeping my child safe, not protecting my mother-in-law's feelings or my husband's relationship with her. Tina touched my elbow and we walked out of the courtroom together. In the hallway, she pulled out the official order and showed me the important parts. She said if my mother-in-law tried to contact my son at all, I needed to call the police right away. Any violation of the order could get her arrested. Tina also said I should think about getting a formal custody agreement that specifically said my husband couldn't let his mother around our son. She explained that the protective order only covered my mother-in-law's actions, not my husband's. If he decided to take our son to see her anyway, the current order wouldn't stop him. I felt sick thinking about that possibility, but Tina said it was better to have everything in writing now, rather than deal with problems later. The next week I had the follow-up appointment with Louis, our son's allergist. I'd been seeing him since my son was 2 and the allergy was first discovered. His office was in a medical building near the hospital, the walls covered with posters about different allergens. Louis came in with my son's file and sat down across from me. I told him everything that happened. His face went from concerned to completely shocked as I explained how my mother-in-law deliberately fed my son peanut butter cookies. He kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe it. When I finished, Louis immediately said he'd write a detailed letter about the severity of the allergy. He pulled out his laptop right there and started typing, asking me questions about the exact timeline of the reaction. He documented how fast my son's face swelled, how quickly he turned blue, how close we came to losing him. The letter outlined every risk of intentional exposure and explained why my son could never be around someone who didn't take the allergy seriously. Louis printed it out and signed it, then made 3 copies for me. He said I should give copies to anyone who might need to understand the medical reality of what happened. Then Louis pulled out my son's current action plan and said we needed to update everything. He wanted me to give new copies to the school nurse, any babysitters and family members I trusted. He wrote out exactly what to do if my son was exposed again, what signs to watch for, when to use the EpiPen. He also said something that surprised me. He suggested I get my son into counseling to process what happened. Louis explained that being deliberately hurt by someone he trusted could affect how my son thought about food and safety going forward. He said kids who go through medical trauma sometimes develop anxiety around eating, especially when the trauma involved someone they loved. I asked if he knew any good therapists, and he recommended Virginia, a child therapist who worked with medical trauma cases. I called Virginia's office from the parking lot after leaving Lewis's appointment. The receptionist said Virginia specialized in helping kids who'd been through scary medical situations and family problems. She had an opening that same week, which felt like a miracle. The receptionist also mentioned Virginia did family sessions if my husband wanted to participate. I wasn't sure about that part, but I made the appointment anyway. When I got home, my husband's car was in the driveway. He'd moved back in 2 days after the court hearing, but things were awful between us. He slept in the guest room down the hall. We barely talked except about basic things like dinner or my son's schedule. The whole house felt heavy with tension, like the air was hard to breathe. I'd catch him looking at me sometimes with this expression I couldn't read. Part angry, part sad, part something else. I wasn't ready to make any big decisions about our marriage. Everything was too chaotic and I needed to focus on my son first. But living like roommates who hated each other was slowly killing me. I just didn't know what else to do. Then something changed. My husband's brother apparently called him and told him he'd screwed up badly. His brother said he needed professional help to figure out why he'd chosen his mother over his own kid's safety. My husband actually listened. He found a therapist and started going once a week. He told me about it one night when I was making dinner. He said he was trying to understand his own behavior and take responsibility. I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard promises before. I told him I was glad he was getting help, but that I needed to see actual change, not just words. He nodded and didn't argue. That felt different. Maybe he was finally getting it, but I wasn't holding my breath. Around the same time, my son started having nightmares. He'd wake up crying, saying the food was making him sick. During meals, he'd ask me 10 times if I was sure something was safe to eat. He only wanted to eat things he watched me prepare from start to finish. If someone else cooked or if we got takeout, he'd refuse to touch it. At his first session with Virginia, I explained what was happening. She said this was a completely normal trauma response. My son had learned that food could hurt him, and that people he trusted might give him dangerous food. His brain was trying to protect him by making him scared of eating anything he couldn't control. Virginia said they'd work through it slowly using play therapy. She'd help him rebuild his sense of safety around food and learn to trust again. It would take time, but kids were good at healing if they got the right support. Hearing that made me feel a little better. Like maybe we'd get through this eventually. 2 weeks after the protective order went into effect, my phone rang while I was making lunch. The school secretary's voice was tight with worry when she told me my mother-in-law was in the parking lot during pickup time. She'd recognized her from the photos I'd given them as part of our safety plan. My stomach dropped and I told her I was on my way. Then she said she'd already called the police like we'd discussed. I grabbed my keys and drove to the school going way over the speed limit, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw a police car already there, and Randy walking toward my mother-in-law's vehicle. She was standing next to her car with her arms crossed, and even from a distance I could see her face was red. Randy was taking notes while she talked, and I parked as far from her as possible before getting out. He waved me over after a few minutes and explained that he'd documented everything. My mother-in-law tried claiming she just wanted to see her grandson from across the parking lot, that she wasn't trying to make contact. Randy told her it didn't matter what her intentions were because any contact violated the court order, even being within 500 feet of the school. She started crying and saying this was ridiculous, that she had rights as a grandmother. Randy stayed calm and professional, explaining she was now in contempt of court, and this violation would be reported to the judge. He gave her a warning that she needed to leave immediately, or she'd be arrested. She got in her car and drove away, but not before giving me a look that made my skin crawl. Randy walked me to the school entrance and I was shaking, so badly I could barely stand. The secretary brought my son out through the office entrance so he wouldn't have to walk through the main pickup area. He didn't see his grandmother and had no idea anything was wrong, which was the only good thing about the whole situation. Randy handed me the incident report number and told me this would definitely be noted in the court file for the permanent order hearing. He said judges took violations seriously, especially when they happened this soon after the order was granted. I thanked him and got my son into the car, checking my mirrors constantly on the drive home to make sure she wasn't following us. When my husband got home from work, I told him what happened before he could even put his bag down. For once, he didn't defend her or make excuses. He got angry, but this time the anger was directed at his mother instead of at me. He said she was jeopardizing any chance she might have for supervised contact in the future, that she was being stupid and selfish. It was the first time since this whole nightmare started that he'd held her accountable instead of blaming me for being too strict. I felt something shift between us, like a tiny crack had formed in the wall we'd built. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, I called Tina and told her about the school incident. She said she'd file a motion to show cause, which meant my mother-in-law would have to appear before the judge and explain why she shouldn't be held in contempt. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and Tina said the judge would not be happy about a violation happening so quickly. When the day came, my mother-in-law sat in the courtroom looking like she'd been crying for days. The judge asked her directly why she'd gone to the school when she knew it violated the protective order. She stammered something about just wanting to see him, that she missed him so much. The judge cut her off and said the order was crystal clear, and ignorance wasn't an excuse. He warned her that another violation would result in criminal charges and possible jail time, and that she was lucky he wasn't putting her in jail right now. She nodded and cried but didn't say anything else. After court, my husband told me he needed to talk to his mother alone. He went to her house that evening and apparently had what he called a come-to-Jesus moment with her. He told her she needed to respect the court order and stop trying to manipulate the situation or find ways around it. She told him he was betraying her, that I'd turned him against his own mother. He said no. She'd betrayed all of them when she deliberately endangered her grandson's life. She tried to argue, but he left before she could guilt-trip him into backing down. When he came home that night, he sat down with me at the kitchen table and actually apologized. Not the half-hearted, sorry you feel that way apology, but a real one. He said he was wrong to minimize my concerns about his mother, wrong to enable her behavior for so long, and wrong to prioritize her feelings over our son's safety. He admitted he should have believed me about the allergy from the start, and never should have left our son with her that day. I told him I appreciated the apology, but trust had to be rebuilt through actions, not just words. He agreed and said he wanted to attend family therapy with Virginia to work on things. He also said he'd support the protective order staying in place for as long as necessary, even if it meant his mother never got unsupervised contact again. Over the next 2 months, we slowly started acting like a family again instead of hostile roommates. Everything felt fragile, like one wrong move could shatter whatever progress we'd made. But my husband proved himself by actually following through on his promises. When his mother called him crying and begging to see her grandson, he told her no. When his brother tried to pressure him into talking me into dropping the order, he shut that down immediately. He started putting our son's needs first, and stopped making excuses for his mother's behavior. We went to therapy every week with Virginia, and my husband worked on understanding why he'd enabled his mother for so long. It turned out he'd spent his whole childhood being told that family loyalty meant never questioning or challenging her, no matter what. Breaking that pattern was hard for him, but he was trying. My son's anxiety around food was getting better too, though he still asked me to check ingredients on everything. The permanent protective order hearing finally arrived, and this time my husband came with me to testify. When the judge asked him about the order, he said he couldn't trust his mother's judgment anymore, and believed the order was necessary to keep our son safe. He told the judge that his mother had shown no real remorse or understanding of how serious her actions were. She sat there crying while her own son testified against her, but I didn't feel bad about it anymore. The judge reviewed the documentation one more time before looking up at my mother-in-law with an expression that made it clear he wasn't impressed. He announced the protective order would become permanent, but added conditions for supervised contact if she completed parenting classes and anger management courses, plus got written clearance from our son's therapist confirming she understood the severity of food allergies and could be trusted. My mother-in-law's face went from hopeful to furious in seconds. She stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly across the courtroom floor and started yelling that this was ridiculous, that she was punished for caring about her grandson. The judge warned her to sit down or be held in contempt, but she grabbed her purse and stormed toward the exit, shouting that she wouldn't jump through hoops to see her own family. The courtroom doors slammed behind her and the sound echoed in the sudden silence. My husband sat there staring at where his mother had been, looking exhausted, but not surprised. Over the following weeks, my son's anxiety around food started getting better with Virginia's help, though the progress came in small steps. He still brought me every snack package and asked me to read the ingredients out loud, his little finger following along as I pointed to each word. At his next appointment, Lewis examined him thoroughly and reviewed his action plan, then told me my son was doing excellent with managing his allergy and was learning to speak up about his needs in age-appropriate ways. 6 months after the hospitalization, my marriage still felt like we were rebuilding something that had been broken into tiny pieces, but we showed up to therapy every week and actually talked about the hard stuff instead of avoiding it. My son was healing with Virginia's support, having fewer nightmares about food, and slowly trusting that meals wouldn't hurt him. The permanent protective order sat in my filing cabinet, a piece of paper that gave me peace knowing my son was legally protected from someone who'd proven she'd rather be right than keep him safe. My mother-in-law never enrolled in a single class or tried to meet any of the judge's conditions, choosing her pride over ever seeing her grandson again. Part of me felt sad that she'd made that choice, but mostly I just felt relieved that I'd put my child's life ahead of keeping the peace with family who didn't deserve it. That's the story for today. Thanks for letting me share it with you. It honestly means a lot that you spend your time here. I hope it brought something gentle or kind to your day. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more like this.